Welcome to Planning a Speech as part of our three-part series on becoming a better public speaker, whether you're a founder in a startup or you're a business owner, just a student, whatever you're doing in life, being a better public speaker can help you to get ahead in life, learn more about how people think, and I guess communicate more clearly to people who really matter. First of all, my name's Dante St. James. I'll be taking you through looking at your audience, looking at your structure, the message that you're going to craft for it, the act of rehearsing, and we'll take a bit of a recap at the end as well. A bit about me, I work with Darwin Innovation Hub's Start NT program. I'm a certified lead trainer with Meta Australia and New Zealand, head of the Australian Institute of Office Professionals in the Northern Territory, the holder of the LinkedIn local chapter here in the NT as well. And I've got my own businesses, ClickStarter, SpeakStarter, The Mail Founder, and LinkedIn Local Darwin. So, your audience, who is that? How do you identify who they are? First of all, why is it even important to know who your audience is? Well, it's all really about allowing the right content for the right people, making sure that you have a plan to reach people correctly and a way that's going to really work for them, a way that means that they're going to connect with you. And you need to make that connection with people who are listening to what you're talking about. If there's no connection, there's no reason for people to hear you. If there's no reason for people to hear you, there's also no reason for people to retain the message that you're trying to put across. So making sure you have some relevance to the people in the audience really helps. But that's great to know. How do you work that out? How do you know who is going to be in your audience as a speaker? It's like asking, how can I research who they're going to be, who they are, how old they might be, what background they come from? And that all comes from an understanding that is all really about verifying on social media the kind of people that this particular speaking task you've been given is aimed towards. You might want to go into the Australian Bureau of Statistics or the equivalent in your country to be able to find the demographics that you'll be working with. And one surefire way to work out who will be in your next speaking engagement will be looking at the past speaking engagements that particular organization has done. Now, that's for those of us who are speaking in a business sense. Not everyone will be doing that, of course. Some will be speaking in very personal environments. We're talking about things like weddings, perhaps funerals or memorials. All those sort of things can be very, very different approaches when it comes to speeches, and we will look at those as well. So tailoring a message comes down to looking at the values of your audience, assessing their concerns, knowing what things really matter to them, and perhaps a little bit of storytelling there as well. Let's break that down a bit more so you can understand what I'm referring to. When we're talking about values, we're talking about the things that people inherit from culture, from the culture around them. And as you probably guessed, not everybody grew up in the same culture. People also have values around money, and sometimes it can be quite destructive to have somebody who's, flashing cash and flexing their Lamborghinis in front of a group of people who are perhaps, close to or have experienced poverty. At the same time, it can be really hard for someone to talk about poverty and hardship when they're talking to a room full of people who are very money driven. It also comes down to a worldview. You don't have to go far to see things like the Arab-Israeli conflict that's going on in Palestine right now, or Ukraine and Russia, that there is a different worldviews coming from different people in different parts of the world. It can be language-based, it can be religion-based, it can be to do with ancient conflicts that sort of, transcend all those things. It could be even the use of language. And I'm not just talking about languages such as Mandarin or Spanish or Portuguese or Thai. I'm talking about the use of language in terms of colloquialisms, slang language. I'm very fortunate that my partner is from a different culture with English as a second language, which allows us then to ensure that when we need to understand each other, that we use the clearest and most concise English possible. If I was to embark on a whole lot of slang and what we call Australianisms for that audience, that would make it very confusing and many of the points would be lost. And what tends to happen is when you're doing a speech with somebody who is from a different background than you are, and you're using cultural slangs and colloquialisms, they get stuck there. They can't listen to the next sentence because they're still trying to work out what happened in the last sentence. And then there's the values of behaviors. And that's where we're talking about, whether it's appropriate to walk on stage with a bare feet, or whether it's, the way you dress or the way that you present yourself. If you're very bold and brash and very loud and boisterous, in front of a group of people who value modesty, and people who are a little bit more quiet and more considered in what they say. Then we look at the concerns that people have. If you're walking in talking to a whole bunch of people about, what it's like to be a single person in this world who can't get a date, and you've got a family and kids oriented audience, it's going to fall a bit flat. So that context of knowing who is in your audience, what their concerns are, is paramount. Right now, there's cost of living is a massive problem right around the world. It's not just an Australian thing. I hear of issues with people with the cost of living in Nigeria, where there is massive inequality and quite a lot of issues with overpopulation, particularly in Lagos, for instance, and the capital being moved from there specifically to try and offset those things. Understanding that some people will be suffering from the cost of living is probably something you need to bear in mind before you start talking about, oh, I just went out and bought this $3,000 Mac. I feel so good and I'm so great and I'm so lucky and blessed, when someone there is saying, I couldn't even afford this conference ticket and I had to get my boss to pay for it. People have concerns around war and famine and disease and those survival parts of life, or societal change. If you're talking to a very conservative crowd, they're not really going to want to hear about all the wonderful things you're doing to change that world in there that they really cherish. At the same time, talking about conservative politics in front of a group of people who are progressive, say, for instance, students at universities, you'll fall flat. So these concerns become something of a context builder. And then the storytelling side of it is where you tell a story in different formats. It could be an emotional story, some inspirational story that's designed to help people to feel, part of a bigger world and to strive for something more. Or it could be the cautionary tale or fable, where the moral at the end of the story is don't do this or don't do that, or be aware that if you do this, it's going to have consequences. That's always a very good story to tell, because it's kind of, moral tales we had as kids. Then there's also relatability when it comes to storytelling. And I'm not going to go too deeply into storytelling. That's a very, very fine art that has to be developed as a skill, like everything in public speaking. And then the obvious one that would come out is, how to be funny, how to tell funny stories, how to relate funny experiences. And not everybody has that skill. And not everything that's funny in my context of life may be funny in your context of life. It could be completely different. But a speech is much more than just the words you say. It's much more than just its content. A speech can be very much about engaging your audience with a lot of different tools. One of those could be asking questions, or votes and polls, asking people with their hands raised in the air, what do they believe about a particular issue? Getting activities, maybe it could be icebreakers where people meet the person next to them in the seat, or it could be as much as getting a Mexican wave going through a larger audience. And presentations are a very obvious way of trying to engage audiences with something that's a little bit more than just a person talking to a microphone and waving their hands about madly. It could be that they are presenting information, statistics, visual graphs. Those kind of things can help people to understand things that they may not understand verbally, but they'll pick them up when they're in a visual format. So structuring your speech then, I guess, is what a lot of people struggle with, because they go, how do I start? Where do I end? How does this work? And this is probably the one thing that anybody from any kind of walk of life could probably figure out. A basic speech has a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like life, really. We have born, we have experiences, and then we pass on to whatever's next. So the typical structure of a speech is very much those three steps, but it can vary depending on where you are. For instance, if you're looking at a TED Talk, you introduce your idea. Then the middle part is that you back it with evidence. And in the end, it's based around a conclusion that you have then based on the evidence that you presented in the middle. That's a very standard kind of speech. And you'll find this in a lot of conferences and seminars as well, a very similar approach. But a wedding speech may be completely similar, where you'll introduce yourself and you'll tell a story about how you know the couple. Then you'll thank all the guests, particularly the mother of the bride is always getting many thanks during these speeches and congratulations. And then story about the one that you know the best. And then it ends with a kind of a fairy tale ending of how they're better now with each other than what they ever were alone. It's a very stock standard wedding speech, and pretty much every wedding speech you'll come across, especially from the best man or from, from the matron of honor, will have that kind of structure to it. Now, how did we ever actually sign on to anything that told us to agree to that? No, because it's a little bit like a story. Hey, I'm going to start off with telling a story from my perspective. I first met this person this long ago, and before I get too underway, I'd like to thank the mother of the bride for, setting up such an amazing reception here. But let's get back on with the story. When I first met Bob, he was probably about 5 years old. We were at school together. And at the end of the day, Bob and Sally are far better off together with each other because Bob honestly is useless and he needs someone to bring his life into order. That's the structure of most wedding speeches. So if you can get that down pat, you've essentially got a wedding speech. Not the only kind of speech, of course. Some conferences tend to have this idea where you state a point, you support the point with evidence, you supply an example, a bit of storytelling, and summarize that point to make it easy for people to understand and take away at the end so they remember what it is they learned. And that's all you do really with any kind of speech, is that you go through those, what we call 4S's: state the point, support the point, supply an example, summarize the point. That's essentially like a business related conference or seminar kind of speech. Doesn't have to be that much more complex than that. When it comes to crafting your message, though, and we're going beyond just the structure of what you're talking about, we're talking about the content of that and what your main point is. What you do want to do is create something that's memorable. And memorable messages are determined by three very, very common things. First, they're very low on jargon. They don't have a lot of colloquialism or jargon in them because that stuff doesn't hit everybody the same way. They tend to be very specific and very concise. They're short, they're very specific, aimed at a very specific topic or a specific circumstance that they're addressing. And they tend to use what we call positive and active language. Positive language is talking about, I guess, you're very optimistic. You're talking about a very positive outcome and a positive story. It could be a life lesson that starts off a little dark, but goes into a nice direction. And active language is where we say, instead of the ball was kicked by Jack, we would say Jack kicked the ball. So it's actually a lot more motivating and it paints a better picture in our head. Instead of going, here's a thing that has had an impact on it, we're saying, here's someone who's caused an impact. It's very positive, very optimistic, and very active, particularly in the English language, where that is a particular thing. There's context that allows that to happen. A compelling message then involves a challenge. It reflects their world. It sparks empathy. And that sparking of empathy is perhaps one of the most important factors because it allows us then to have some kind of place where we can say, yeah, you know what? That empathy, that really resonates with me. I get that. I feel that. I can imagine that. I can step inside someone's shoes for a moment and actually picture what they would be feeling. And that makes me feel something too. And that usually happens because there's some sort of challenge which is very common to them and to other people, or it may reflect their world in some way that it makes them think, you know what? I get this. I experience this myself. I understand all of this. Moving on to rehearsals and deliveries, we're talking about why we rehearse. Why do we rehearse anyway? Because it seems like a ridiculous thing to do. Can't we just get up there and wing it? Well, I think YouTube and TikTok are full of examples of why you should rehearse. Part of that is to reduce the anxiety for when you get up there. If you've gone through it a few times, you have that muscle memory. You know what's coming up. You know how it's going to come out. You can test things, spot the problems in your speech and fix them along the way. What I would also do is that most people write their speeches on a computer or on paper. And when they read it inside their head, the inside voice sounds very different to the out loud voice. When you think of something on paper and then you take that to actually talk about it, there's a reason why people, when they're reading from speech notes, they struggle a lot with that, because the out loud voice, it sounds differently. We talk differently than what we write. The writing voice is very different to the talking voice. And we rehearse too, because you've been given 3 minutes to do this speech and you take 11 and a half minutes, someone's going to be really annoyed by that. So you've got to make sure you do that and be respectful of time. So some of the ways to rehearse, you can practice with it, stopwatch, mirror, practice in front of people who are going to give you constructive feedback, or just put your own phone camera in the way and record it, see what it looks and sounds like, and then tweak things along the way. But just be kind to yourself. No one's asking you to be a TED talker just yet. They're just saying, hey, this is a skill you can learn. Here's something you can do. Now, the effective delivery part of it is a lot to do with body language and using variation in your voice, speeding things up, slowing them down. Humans tend to be bursty in the way they speak. We speak in short sentences. We go fast in long sentences. We have variety in the way we deliver things. The tones go up, tones go down, and we pause. And a lot of that can be slowing down, pausing between points to let those points sink in for people. I'm not going to go deeply into this today because that is a whole seminar just on its own. So to recap before we go, consider who the person is you're actually speaking to. Create a structure that really follows that whole thing of, have a beginning so you know how to begin, have points that you want to share, and then an end that's very clear and allows you to get out nice and cleanly. Craft a message that's compelling by using examples that people can relate to, creating some empathy, a response from people, and then a rehearsal as well. Make sure you rehearse it before you then got some kind of way to deliver it live, because you don't want to be reading that speech for the very first time in front of a live audience. You want to do it in front of your camera phone or at least a mirror so you know what it looks and feels like. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. A really short one. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from that. I'm Dante St. James. Speakstarter.com.au is where you can find out more and even get some little help further along the track and join me for my other webinars that are available for booking right now. I'm Dante St. James. Thank you so much for joining me, and I do hope you have a fantastic week. See you later.